Preface. To many people, economics is as confusing as physics. Just as we use physics every day, even if we don't know its technical aspects, we all use economics on a daily basis, even if we don't know its technical aspects. Yet, unlike physics, introductory economics is not as difficult as it might appear at first. However, it is true that economists speak a different language in the sense that we often use terms that are not common in everyday conversation. For example, economists use terms such as the natural rate of unemployment, the elasticity of demand, opportunity cost, and comparative advantage. These terms are nothing more than a shorthand way of conveying a general concept that all economists understand, even if they don't necessarily agree with each other's conclusions. While specific terms will be introduced throughout the text, this introductory discussion will focus on some general terms and concepts. What exactly is economics? You are probably familiar with economic terms from watching the nightly news or reading the daily newspaper. Economics is often discussed in terms of unemployment, the stock market, gross national product, the trade deficit, or consumer confidence. However, none of these topics really defines economics. Instead, these are elements of the broader set of questions that economics addresses. Economics is often thought of as a boring, dry field populated with nerdy professors who have spent too much time indoors looking at tables of numbers and discussing how things might work in the real world, while ignoring what actually happens in the real world. Such stereotypes are embodied in terms such as dismal science and clichés, such as economists know the price of everything but the value of nothing. However, these terms are used by those who do not understand economics and its connection to everyday life. Believe it or not, the vast majority of economists are not concerned in their professional or academic lives with the intricacies of the unemployment rate. As in other fields of investigation, such as medicine, engineering, or chemistry, economists often specialize in one or more subfields of investigation. These subfields have many underlying similarities, even though they demand specific concepts. Economics, broadly defined, includes the analysis of education, sports, international trade, public policy, strategy, politics, marriage, family development, transportation networks, military conflict, and pollution, as well as the intricacies of the unemployment rate and trade balances. However, even listing these subfields fails to convey what economics is truly about. There are many definitions of economics. Even famous and brilliant economists have often disagreed amongst themselves about a simple one-sentence definition of economics. One easy definition of economics is the study of choice, or how individuals make choices in everyday life. This definition does not induce cartwheels or excitement in most people. However, an alternative definition seems a bit more interesting. Economics is the study of how to allocate limited resources to unlimited wants. This definition implies the study of choice or allocation of scarce resources, but conveys the important point that economics is grounded in the hard reality that most things that are desirable are unfortunately scarce. Introduction. For the most part, we all desire more of one thing or another, and for many reasons, it is likely that we are not able to satisfy all of these desires. For instance, you might want a new car, but are unable to afford one. You face scarcity in your disposable income. Another person may easily afford a new car, but wants to spend more time with her family. Still, another person might want a job as a taxidermist in Ames, Iowa, when there is no job to be had. This person would face a scarcity in the job market, perhaps not of their own volition, but a scarcity nonetheless. The point is, choice without scarcity is rather uninteresting. What proves interesting, to economists at least, is how individuals, whether they be parents, employees or business owners, make choices when they are limited in their ability to satisfy all their wants and desires. Everybody knows that some choices are easy and other choices can prove very painful. However, for the most part, economics does not focus on the difficulties in reaching decisions. Rather, economics focuses on the process and consequences of making decisions. When a choice is made, certain other options are necessarily not chosen. If there weren't, there would be no scarcity. Of all these possibilities involved in a choice, the most valuable option foregone in that choice is considered the opportunity cost. For example, consider your choice to spend 1 hour studying economics. There are countless other things you could do in that same hour, say, sit under a tree and contemplate life, watch television, or read a book. Each of these countless other things you could do can, at least conceptually, be assigned a dollar value, say $10 per hour for sitting under a tree, $6 an hour for watching television, and $3 an hour for reading a book. Assuming these are the only 3 things you might do instead of studying economics, the opportunity cost of studying economics would be sitting under a tree, contemplating life. The simple example of opportunity cost given above is arguably silly. However, it is often through seemingly silly thought exercises that economic concepts are most easily understood, at least initially. Economics is not as abstract as you might be led to believe by watching the nightly news. In reality, economists are often most interested in understanding how actual people and organizations reach their decisions. Economists delineate different types of decision makers into 3 types of economic agents. An economic agent is any individual, group of individuals or organization that participates in the allocation of scarce resources to unlimited desires. The 3 types of agents that economists analyze are households, firms, and governments. A household is a person or group of people that acts as a single decision-making unit, typically in the area of consumption. For example, you and your roommates buying groceries or paying the power bill would be considered a household. However, individuals can also be considered a household. For example, a hitchhiker, a homeless person, or an individual shopping for clothes. A firm is an organized entity that produces goods or services for households and other firms. Examples include the corporations that many of us would recognize, such as General Motors. However, the neighborhood boy who mows lawns would also be considered a firm in economics. Firms are organized and managed by households. A government is an organization that provides goods and services to households and firms, provides redistribution of income, and provides a structure of laws in which firms and households can operate with some level of certainty. Governments are organized, manned, and managed by households. Agents interact in an economy. An economy is an overarching mechanism that facilitates the allocation of scarce resources to competing uses. An economy decides 3 things. A. What goods are produced and in what quantities. B. How goods are produced. And C. The distribution of the goods produced. Chapter 1. Basics of Microeconomics. There are different types of economies in today's world. A pure market economy, also known as laissez-faire capitalism, is an economy in which individual households and firms determine the allocation of resources, and the government plays an extremely limited role, primarily in enforcing property rights through a legal system and providing for a common defense. A certainly planned economy, also known as a command economy, is one in which a single individual or small group of individuals determines the allocation of resources, and individual firms and households have little say over what is produced, how goods are produced, and the distribution of these goods. A mixed economy is one in which government plays a more active role in the market process, including regulation, standardization, taxation, and income redistribution. Households and firms still have some control over what is produced, how goods are produced, and the distribution of those goods. However, the government also influences these decisions. A market is a mechanism that facilitates the exchange of specific scarce resource amongst competing agents. There are 2 major types of markets. A. Goods markets, in which services and finished goods are exchanged, and B. Factor markets, in which factors or production, that is, the things used to produce other goods and services, are exchanged. A good is anything deemed desirable by the agents in the economy, e.g., soda, pizza, Porsches, running water, or a lack of pollution. Factors of production are items used to produce goods and services. There are 3 major factors of production. Land, all natural resources, gold, coal, plutonium, etc., and the like. Labour. Effort, mental and physical, of human beings. Capital. All equipment, tools, factories, and goods used in production. Thus far, the terms introduced are part of the basic language of economics. Once these and similar definitions are understood, economists can talk to each other with little difficulty. However, it is valuable to also delineate general areas of focus within the overall field of economics. In general, there are two major branches of economics. Microeconomics is the study of individual markets, how individual agents interact within those markets, and how individual economic agents make decisions. Macroeconomics is the study of national and global economic activity. To many, this distinction seems relatively semantic. After all, you can't have the macroeconomy, that is a national economy, without the microeconomy, that is individual economic agents. While this is true, the areas of focus are somewhat exclusive to each field, although many economists would argue this point. Macroeconomists focus on general time trends and the national or perhaps regional level. These issues would include the overall unemployment rate, overall interest rates, and whether the national income of a country is increasing or decreasing, although this list is by no means exhaustive. On the other hand, microeconomists would perhaps investigate the unemployment rate in a particular industry, or the number of employees hired by a particular firm, or whether a firm will purchase new technology at prevailing interest rates. Notice the subtle difference in the level of focus between the two areas. Macroeconomics is akin to astronomy or the study of the universe as a whole, whereas microeconomics is akin to molecular chemistry or the understanding of how the basic building blocks of the universe operate. While the tools of the trade can often be considered dry, just like the tools of any trade, economists shouldn't not be seen as typical brethrens who lacks any form of compassion and are likely to go into too many factual details, embodied in the cliché that economists know the prices of everything and the value of nothing. This is not the case, and some of the most heated and interesting debates in economics center on our concern over value rather than price. Economists are humans and enjoy the same range of emotion as others, even if economists are quick to point out, on the other hand. The perception that economists are too factual is the consequence of confusion between positive economics, which is the study of what is, and normative economics, which is the study of what should be. Positive economics addresses questions such as, what is unemployment? Whereas normative economics addresses questions such as, what should the government do about unemployment? The first question is in the spirit of just the facts, ma'am, whereas the second question is more philosophical and usually controversial. Again, the distinction might seem semantic to many people, but it gets to the heart of economic analysis. Economists are deeply concerned with many things, including how to foster economic development in third world countries, how to reduce criminal activity in the inner city, and how best to fund public goods such as national defense and road construction. However, before the question of what should be done about a particular problem, it is first necessary to understand the facts of the problem. Hence, economists often focus first on the positive and then on the normative. Both positive and normative statements are tested using economic theories, which are generally based on an economic model. An economic model is a simplified view of reality. Because it is very difficult to capture all of the aspects of reality in a model, we simplify our view of reality to focus on the particular question being asked. An economic model is comprised of two parts: assumptions and implications. The assumptions are simplifications of reality and are valid only within the context. Chapter 2. Old to New Economic Imperialism. Government interventions in the market. Markets are surprisingly resilient mechanisms. When left to their own devices, suppliers and demanders interact with each other through price and quantity to reach equilibrium. If price is allowed to freely fluctuate, a change in either supply or demand that leads to a shortage causes price to increase, whereas a change in either supply or demand that leads to a surplus causes price to decrease. Both of these reactions allow a market to obtain equilibrium after something has changed. However, many times the response by the market is not what people desire. For instance, when a hurricane warning is in effect in Florida, it is likely that the demand for plywood will increase and the supply of plywood will not increase dramatically in the immediate short run. Given our knowledge of supply and demand, we would expect the price of plywood to increase in the short run. This is the market's response to the increase in demand and is rather intuitive. Unfortunately, people often do not like the market's response and accuse suppliers of price gouging or charging exorbitant prices. Legislation in many states makes it illegal for suppliers to increase their prices dramatically, even if demand increases dramatically in the short run. In the case of plywood, if price is not allowed to increase after an increase in demand, the quantity demanded will be greater than the quantity supplied, and there will be a shortage in the market. In a free market, prices would increase, and some people would be priced out of the market for plywood. These individuals would hopefully find some alternative to plywood with which to protect their property. However, if the price is not allowed to increase, then people who would normally be priced out of the market stick around, hoping for plywood and perhaps being lucky enough to obtain some. In cases like this, individuals who obtain the product have in essence won a lottery instead of participating in a market in which price reveals the value that people place on the product. The only agent that has the means and power to intervene in markets of reasonable size is the government. Governments intervene in many, if not most, markets in various ways, including regulation, taxation, standardization, liability, and other forms of control. At this point, we will focus on government interventions that focus on how price and quantity can respond to market changes. We will readdress government intervention in the market process later. There are three basic interventions that governments can undertake in a market: price floors, or policies that limit how low prices can fall, price ceilings, or policies that limit how high prices can rise, and quantity quotas, or limits on how much quantity can be sold in the market. And the belief has become stronger, even predominant over much else within the discipline. In this respect, the collapse of the post-war boom and of Keynesianism in the 1970s and its displacement by monetarism are extremely important in three ways. First, although not of immediate concern to our account of microeconomics as such, the rise of monetarism and ultimately its passage to the new classical economics heavily consolidated the presence of microeconomics within the discipline, as macroeconomics became based upon the optimizing behavior of individuals, including their rational expectation formation. The so-called micro-foundations of macroeconomics clearly signalled the success of economics imperialism within its home discipline, switching microeconomic theory to a position of precedence over macroeconomics. Second, the rise of neoliberalism encouraged a corresponding extension of microeconomic principles to what had previously been the insulated and more inductive applied and policy branches of the discipline, from industrial through to development economics. Third, and most important of all, was less the galloping success of economics imperialism on the grounds of extending microeconomic principles on the basis of as if perfectly working markets, but in the partial reaction against this in its most extreme form. This original, old-style phase of economics imperialism was supplemented, or even displaced, by a new phase in which emphasis was placed not on treating non-market factors as if they could be analysis, as if equivalent to a perfectly working market, but on the non-market understood as the consequence of or response to imperfectly working markets. Most significant in this shift, then, has been the appeal to market imperfections, especially asymmetric information. Precisely because it is built upon the notion that markets work imperfectly, this new development within microeconomics represents a critical departure from neoliberal ideology in the sense of pure support for laissez-faire. But it is equally important to emphasize how it totally accepts TA2 as its analytical foundations, and within macroeconomics, it also tends to accept rational expectations. Despite this, and its corresponding commitment to methodological individualism, it is able to produce some remarkable results on the simple premise that some individuals come to market with different information than others. First, as mentioned, is that markets do not work perfectly. Second, for details of which these imperfections can take one of three forms, markets may clear, i.e. supply equal demand, but be inefficient. Some could ideally be made better off without anyone else being made worse off. Markets may not clear, supply and demand do not equal but prices do not move, so there are trades that could be made that would be mutually beneficial. And markets might not be formed at all. Third, especially in light of the latter two possible outcomes, even though the economics is based upon the optimizing behavior of individuals, it is able to explain the presence of structures rather than, as in other economic approaches and social sciences, structures are taken as given as the basis to explain what individuals can or cannot do. This is because, for example, if the labour market does not clear, wages do not fall even though there is unemployment, essentially because employers want more loyal, productive, conscientious employees and can only guarantee this through a higher wage than they need to pay, with the extra wage costs more than worth it in terms of profitability. There is generated, and not assumed, a structural division between the employed and the unemployed, with no reason for the wage to fall. Such reasoning does not apply exclusively to the labour markets, it is of general applicability. With these three possible outcomes, and perfectly working, efficient markets is a special case, asymmetric information economics is able to offer an explanation for possibly inefficient market structures throughout the economy. And at the macroeconomic level too, restoring Keynesian macroeconomics on micro-foundations in its own image. But nor is it simply economic structures and their corresponding inefficiencies that are addressed. These do themselves form the basis for explaining non-market factors, for they can be seen as providing the rationale for non-market, possibly collective, behavior to correct market imperfections. The classic example of this is Akerlof's market for lemons, the second-hand car market. Asymmetric information means that better cars cannot trade at a premium and poorer cars at a discount, so that the market works imperfectly, because buyers cannot distinguish them. It makes sense for legitimate dealers to set up a warranty, i.e. non-market system. Such a parable is an indicative proxy for all non-market outcomes and, most dramatically, to explain the existence of the state as the biggest corrector of market failures of them all. However, the extent of interventionism associated with this new microeconomics should not be exaggerated. It is piecemeal and contingent upon the extent to which there are market imperfections and whether intervention, still motivated by individual gain by those forming and acting through such intervention, leads to better outcomes than without them. This is of lesser concern here than in observing the extent to which the new asymmetric information microeconomics heavily advanced the cause of economics imperialism. It did so on the sides of both supply and demand. On the supply side, the notion of market imperfections as an explanation for both economic and social structures opened up an almost unlimited terrain of applications for economic principles. As far as other social sciences are concerned, on the demand side the departure from as if perfectly working markets and the sudden dramatic discovery by economists that institutions and structures more generally matter considerably added to the appeal of economics imperialism. This new phase of economics imperialism, taking its cue from the old as a critical point of departure through the introduction of market imperfections, had the effect of rejuvenating the old applications as well as introducing a whole range of new fields, often with the moniker new attached: the new development economics, the new economic sociology, the new institutional economics, the new welfare economics, the new economic history, the new financial economics, and so on. It is worth reiterating that the corresponding widening scope of application, both within economics itself and in colonizing the subject matter of other social science, continued to rely upon TA2, despite the processes of BBI, what had been left out to establish it in the first place. Chapter 3. Labour Market. The mainstream microeconomics of labour markets is dominated by the idea that the labour market is like any other in the sense of being subject to exactly the same principles of analysis as all other markets, which are presumed themselves to be subject analytically to common and universal principles. The focus for employment, as for all else, is upon what determines supply and demand and how they interact with one another. At the crudest level, often projected to span both micro and macro, it follows that if there is any unemployment, then there must be an excess supply of labour and real wages, or some other reward to labour, such as employment rights or fringe benefits, that are too high and which should adjust downwards to bring about market equilibrium by reducing supply and increasing demand. Of course, appeal to market imperfections, whether at the micro or macro levels, might be used to justify state intervention. See below on minimum wages and also varieties of Keynesian theory for the macroeconomics of involuntary unemployment. Does this mean that the market for labour is the same as the market for fish? Some mainstream economists suggest not, since workers are human and can think and behave for themselves unlike fish, or possibly more appropriately, ping-pong balls, as the latter do not act on their own account, whereas fish at least seek to evade capture. However, both fish and ping-pong balls may not be able to bring themselves to the market to trade, but they do have, as it were, representatives to trade on their behalf. And much the same is true of trade unions in representing their members in the labour market. Does this make them more or less fish-like or manipulated dupes as those who oppose trade unionism would have it? Even those who are not unionised and are taken on in the labour market casually and individually are in a sense represented by the norms governing the exercise of labour, however much these are or are not observed in practice. Significantly, the social theorist Karl Polanyi argued that land, labour and finance were three commodities for which treating them like any other would ultimately lead to a social reaction against such commodification and in favour of reasserted forms of social control, what he called a double movement between treating them as if they were ordinary commodities and in opposition to doing so. It is not clear, though, that such a double movement is confined to these three commodity markets alone, since all commodities and markets are governed by shifting regulations and norms to a greater or lesser extent. Nor is there any reason why those buying and selling commodities of any sort should not be equally subject to motives other than self-interest, or be governed by independent thought and social norms, and so going beyond targeting the bottom line in the accounts or in pursuit of self-interest. In short, what distinguishes labour markets is not the agency of those doing the selling, the employee, or the buying, the employer, but the nature of what is bought and sold. Karl Marx offers the most sophisticated analysis of this issue, highlighting that there is not and cannot be a labour market, for it is not labour as such that is bought and sold, as, for example, an input into a production function, but the capacity to work. For Marx, only under capitalism is the capacity to work bought and sold with a wage as its price. Under other economic systems, such as slavery, the capacity to work is not bought and sold other than indirectly through the purchase of the labourers themselves. These considerations point to a conclusion that has already been advanced in the context of other microeconomic topics, for consumption, production, competition and technical change, that the microeconomic needs to be set in its historical and social context. This is exactly the opposite of the way in which the mainstream proceeds. On the basis of its technical apparatus, labour markets are conceptually embedded in universal categories, only after which their social and historical specificity is addressed. To put it polemically, is slave labour and wage labour the same as labour, merely being allocated to production in different ways? For the mainstream, the answer would appear to be yes, at least in so far as labour is simply treated as an input into a production function like any other input and like any production. Y equals F, K, L. Likewise, labour can be introduced as a variable in the utility function, although this is considered negatively as contributing to disutility, and once again, it might be asked if the disutility of slave and wage labour are the same if the same work is done for the same amount of time without regard to the context in which the work is done. Interestingly, the disutility of labour has taken two very different forms in the mainstream. The first has been met before. It reflects the idea that labour is a resource of time that the worker has, but is able to give up and sell to the employer. What is given up or foregone is the positive contribution made to utility by leisure. What is done with that leisure time is rarely examined, although no doubt it is considerably enhanced in quality by the goods that can be purchased in return for the wages earned by the leisure given up. Chapter 4. Productions and Cost Functions Rule. Many readers will first meet the theory of supply in the form of a cost function, CQ, where C is the cost of supplying quantity Q. With a given price for output P, the profit-maximizing firm will set marginal cost equal to price CQ equals P, with profit maximum as opposed to minimum, as long as CQ is negative at the profit-maximizing output. This leaves many questions unanswered. On the cost side, why are costs the way they are? How does production take place, and with what inputs and technology? On the price side, why is the price as the level that it is, and why should it be taken as given? The assumption of given prices is usually justified by appeal to perfect competition. It is presumed that if a firm increases its price, it will lose all sales to competitors, and reducing price will reduce potential profits. On this basis, fixed prices as a result of competition are taken as a standard starting point for the theory of supply. On the cost side, the theory of production takes a production function, Q equals F times x1, x2, x3, etc. xn, as its starting point, where x1, x2, x3, etc. xn are the inputs needed to produce output Q. Many students will also be familiar with this formulation, especially with the idea that the marginal product of a factor input, x, I, will be set equally to its relative price for the cost-minimizing firm, Fi equals Pi to P, where P is the given price of the output, as long as marginal products are decreasing, Fii is less than 0. This requires that input prices, Pi, as well as output price, P, are competitive insofar as firms can buy as many inputs as they like at the given prices, Pi, and sell at price P as much as they like of the output they make with those inputs. To some degree, the assumptions that have been made already could be relaxed. Smoothly differentiable production and cost functions are not strictly necessary. Also, allowance could be made for joint production, more than one type of output from the inputs rather than a single output, Q. This will all be set aside in order to simplify the presentation of technical details in what follows. But before engaging in the technicalities, it is worth reminding ourselves of the extent to which the theory of supply is reduced, for a number of reasons related to the requirements of deriving a theory of supply from the technical apparatus attached to the production function. First, as is apparent from the formalities, the theory of production is universal and, correspondingly, asocial and ahistorical. It could prevail in any circumstances across any sector and context. Indeed, production is reduced to a simple relationship between inputs and outputs without regard to what these inputs and outputs are, and without an examination of the production process itself, who does what and how. There is even a total absence of human agency in two respects, apart from the presumed profit-maximizing entrepreneur. On the one hand, there are no bosses with no one telling others what to do, although entrepreneurship might be considered to be one of the inputs XI. On the other hand, labour and workers occupy no special place in the theory, being designated as an input like any other. So they are bought at a price, presumably the wage, and used as an input just like any other, with marginal product of labour set equal to the real wage. In a similar way to the theory of consumption and demand, inputs as well as outputs have no specificity precisely in order to enable them to be expressed formally in undifferentiated mathematical form. There must even be doubts about whether this represents production in any meaningful sense, as it is reduced to something goes in and something comes out, and could correspond to any quantitative process of this type, a chemical reaction for example. Put in hydrogen and oxygen and you get water. Second, by the same token, not only is technology taken as given by the production function f, it too is not specified, potentially ranging from simple peasant farming to high-tech methods. There is no account of where technology comes from and how it might change. Third, related to but distinct from the previous points, there is no consideration of how production is organized, and the same applies to distribution and sale. Whilst there is a presumption of wage labour and production for profit, this is not even implicit within the production function itself. Does it not make a difference if production is organised as wage labour for the production of commodities that are going to be sold, as opposed to domestic production for own use, for example, or even a squirrel running around gathering nuts with its labouring time and tree inputs? Fourth, the assumption of perfect competition is made in order that individual optimization can take place without needing to second-guess what other individuals might or might not be doing. Prices of outputs and inputs can be taken as given. Fifth, even with these assumptions already in place, it is still necessary to impose restrictions on production conditions in order that the optimization can be satisfactorily achieved. There must be decreasing returns to factors or to scale overall, otherwise for given input and output prices it is more profitable to increase output indefinitely, as profits just go on increasing the more you produce and sell. Conclusion. Bearing the previously made considerations in mind, the theory of production is heavily determined by the production function f. It can be used in a number of familiar ways. First is to minimize costs of producing a given output Q. Formally, minimize C equals P1 x1 plus etc. Pn xn subject to F times x1 etc. xn equals Q. If this problem is solved, through use of the Lagrange multiplier for example, Higgs-sign conditional on given output Q, input demands will be derived. These correspond to the Higgs-sign conditional or compensated consumer demand, in which a fixed utility is required at minimum expenditure. Accordingly, HI tells us the demand for input XI in minimizing cost to produce output Q with input prices PI. XI equals HI times QP1, etc. PN. Input demands will in general depend on their relative prices and how much is produced at minimum cost. These input demand functions have certain properties. They will be increasing in Q, more demand for inputs to produce more output. They will be homogeneous of degree 1 in the prices, double all inputs prices and you double your costs but purchase the same inputs. And they will be decreasing in own price. Having derived input demands, the minimum cost can now be found by adding up inputs costs to give the cost function. C equals C times Q P1, etc. Pn. In its simplest form, this is the familiar cost function. C equals CQ, where input prices are taken as permanently fixed and drop away from the function. More generally, in allowing input prices to vary explicitly, it follows that C is increasing in Q. It costs more to produce more. Homogeneous of degree 1 in input prices, if you double all prices, costs will double. And convex in prices, increasing in input prices but less than or equal in proportion, because if input prices change, the worst you could do in producing a given output is to use those inputs you are already using, and so cost can only go up in proportion to the prices themselves, and you might do better by changing your input mix. Further, the minimum cost to produce output is entirely analogous to the minimum cost to produce a given level of utility, merely substituting F for U. It follows that the cost function C for a given output Q is analogous to the expenditure function. And Shepard's lemma also applies, so that we can more or less paraphrase from our demand theory for our producer or supply theory. The extra cost from Shepard's lemma, the extra cost to produce from an increase in an input price is primarily the result of the extra cost of the inputs you are already using, with substitution into less expensive inputs of lesser order significance. Further, because of the pure substitution effect in moving around an isoquant in response to changing relative input prices, delta H and delta Pj should be positive unless I equals j, in which case it is negative. In other words, substituting along or around an isoquant from one input I to another input j is equal and opposite to going the other way around, and is positive as with indifference curves as opposed to isoquants. About IntroBooks. IntroBooks delivers up to the minute information covering everything on a topic in only 1 hour of reading. Our books are written to give essential information in a straight-to-the-point, easy-to-read format. We have cut out technical jargon, waffle, and unnecessary filler to ensure you get the essential information you need to achieve your goals with confidence.